The August sun bore down upon the Wyoming territory with a fury that seemed almost personal, turning the endless prairie into a furnace where the very air shimmered and danced above the cracked red earth. Inside the weathered wagon, Genevieve Thornton maintained her posture with the rigid discipline her mother had instilled years ago, though her golden hair beneath the once white bonnet was now matted with dust, the color of dried blood. Beside her, Phoebe gripped the wooden rail with white knuckles, her left leg throbbing with each violent jolt as the wheels found every stone and rut in the trail. The burn scars that climbed from her collarbone to her jaw felt tight in the heat, pulling at the skin with every breath she took. The mountains ahead rose like jagged promises against a sky so intensely blue it seemed painted their peaks crowned with snow that offered the only hope of relief from this merciless heat. Between the sisters and those distant summits stretched 40 miles of grassland, broken only by beejai and wind-twisted juniper, a landscape that cared nothing for human suffering or hope. Their father was 2 months in his grave. His debts had devoured everything except this single claim, a homestead in Angel's Crossing, a town they had never seen described in letters that now seemed like fairy tales written by a desperate man. Genevieve believed those letters because the alternative was unthinkable. Phoebe, who had learned early that the world judged value by appearance and found her wanting, had stopped believing in fairy tales the night the kitchen fire had marked her for life. The crack of the first rifle shot split the silence like an axe through kindling. Genevieve's hands flew to her throat, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. Phoebe's head snapped around, and she saw them immediately, 4 riders cresting the ridge to the east, their faces masked, rifles glinting in the brutal sunlight as they spurred their horses down the slope in a cloud of dust and violence. "Bandits," Phoebe said, her voice oddly calm despite the ice flooding her veins. The riders came fast, whooping and firing as they closed the distance. Bullets whined through the air with that distinctive wasp-like buzz that Phoebe would remember for the rest of her life. One round punched through the canvas cover above their heads, the sudden shaft of sunlight illuminating the meager possessions piled behind them. Flour sacks bought on credit, a trunk containing their mother's dresses, tools their father would never use. The gray mare screamed in terror and bolted. Genevieve lunged for the reins, but they whipped through her gloved fingers like snakes. The wagon lurched forward with such violence that Phoebe was thrown against the backrest, her damaged leg twisting beneath her at an angle that sent white lightning up her spine. She bit her lip so hard, she tasted blood, refusing to cry out. The ground ahead dropped away into a dry wash where stones thrust up like broken teeth. If the panicked horse dragged them into that ravine, the impact would shatter the axle and crush them both beneath tons of splintering wood. Another shot so close that the bullet's passage stirred Phoebe's hair. Then a rider appeared, as if materializing from the heat itself. He came from their right flank, riding low over a paint pony, whose coat bore the distinctive white handprints of Lakota tradition. His black hair streamed behind him, unbound and wild, and his buckskin shirt was fringed at the shoulders and decorated with intricate beadwork. With a grace that defied the chaos, he threw himself from the saddle while the pony was still moving his boots, hitting the earth in a dead sprint, and seized the gray mare's bridle with both hands. The horse reared, foam flying from her mouth, but the warrior held on. He dug his heels into the dirt and threw his weight backward, every muscle in his shoulders and arms standing out with the strain. The wagon slewed sideways gravel, spraying the right wheels lifting so high that Phoebe could see the ground rushing past beneath them. Then they stopped. The warrior had dragged them to a halt barely 8 feet from the edge of the wash. Dust billowed around them in choking clouds. The bandits fired again, a ragged volley, and one bullet tore through the wagon's side panel so close to Phoebe's hip that she felt the scorching heat of its passage and heard the wood splinter like breaking bones. The Lakota man swung both sisters down from the bench with hands that were impersonal but careful, then stepped in front of them and drew a carbine from his pony's saddle. He fired twice the shots, precise and unhurried, and the riders on the ridge wheeled their mounts and vanished back over the crest as suddenly as they had appeared. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Genevieve stood trembling, her hands pressed to her bodice as if holding her racing heart inside her chest. Phoebe leaned against the wagon wheel, her injured leg shaking so badly she could barely keep her feet. She looked up at their rescuer and truly saw him for the first time, tall and powerfully built, with a face of sharp angles and eyes the gray of river stones. A Lakota warrior, an enemy to most white settlers in this territory. He met her gaze, and something wordless passed between them, a recognition deeper than language, the understanding shared by those who have just escaped death and know how thin the margin truly was. Then he gathered his pony's reins without speaking and rode toward the pine-covered foothills, leaving the sisters alone in the vast indifference of the prairie, with only the pounding of their hearts to prove they still lived. Angel's Crossing could barely claim the title of town. It was a raw assemblage of unpainted lumber buildings lining a single wide street churned into a morass of mud and manure, surrounded by tent camps and half-built structures that spoke more of hope than reality. The smell of fresh-cut pine mingled with wood-smoke whiskey and the acrid tang of unwashed humanity. Men filled the street, their eyes following the sisters' wagon with an attention that made Phoebe's skin crawl. The few women she glimpsed moved quickly from shelter to shelter, heads down as if afraid to be noticed. The Thornton Ranch sat 3 miles west, reached by a track that wound through stands of cottonwood, whose leaves whispered secrets in the constant wind. The cabin was smaller than their Pennsylvania home's root cellar, a single room of chinked logs with a tar paper roof and one window covered in oiled canvas that admitted light but no view. A sagging porch faced east, and along its railing grew an incongruous profusion of wild roses, their white blooms luminous against weathered wood, their perfume almost painfully sweet. But behind the cabin, as their father's letters had promised, water bubbled from living rock. The spring emerged from a cleft in the granite hillside, cold and crystal-clear, gathering in a natural basin before spilling down through channels that fed a creek running north toward the river. In this high desert where water meant survival and prosperity, that spring transformed worthless land into the most coveted property between Angel's Crossing and the Lakota territories. Their father had died owing money to merchants, freighters, and suppliers throughout the territory. But the largest debt bore the name Claude Devereux. Phoebe met him on their 3rd morning. She had limped to the freight office to arrange delivery of supplies, flour, salt, pork, lamp oil, nails for repairs, and found herself escorted to a back room that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Behind a desk of polished mahogany sat a man of perhaps 40 years, his dark hair silvered at the temples and slicked back with expensive pomade. He wore a suit of dove-gray wool, tailored in an Eastern style, and his hands resting on the desk were clean and manicured, the hands of a man who never touched dirt or hard labor. "Miss Thornton," he said, rising with practiced grace. "What a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Your father spoke of you with great affection." Phoebe lowered herself into the offered chair, acutely conscious of her worn dress, her pronounced limp, the scars she could never hide, no matter how high she pulled her collar. "You knew our father, Mr. Devereux?" "I had the privilege of conducting business with him, yes." His smile was warm but did not quite reach his pale eyes. Samuel Thornton was a man of grand visions, though perhaps his reach occasionally exceeded his grasp. The ranch possesses remarkable potential, but realizing that potential requires significant capital investment and experienced management, I believe we might find mutually beneficial terms." "What manner of terms?" "A partnership of sorts. I provide the necessary capital-improved breeding stock, proper fencing, irrigation infrastructure. In return, I would receive a share of future profits and certain considerations regarding property management." His gaze moved over her with the same dismissive efficiency one might use to evaluate a broken tool. However, such delicate negotiations are perhaps better conducted with your sister. Miss Genevieve is the elder, if I understand correctly. By 2 years, yes. Then propriety suggests she is the appropriate party for such discussions. He stood, making it clear the interview had concluded. Please convey my compliments and inform her that I would be honored to host her for supper tomorrow evening. There are matters of considerable urgency that would benefit from her particular insights. Phoebe made the long walk back to the ranch, with her legs screaming protest at every step, her mind worrying at the conversation like a tongue probing a broken tooth. Devereaux had asked nothing about the property's actual condition, the water rights, or the outstanding debts. He had not inquired whether they intended to stay or sell. His interest, she understood with growing unease, lay in something else entirely. That night, while Genevieve unpacked their meager belongings inside the cabin, Phoebe sat on the porch steps and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold. A rider appeared on a distant rise, silhouetted against the dying light. Though she could discern no features at this distance, she knew him instantly. The set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse, as if they were a single creature, the fringe of his buckskin shirt moving in the wind. The Lakota warrior who had saved them. She lifted one hand in tentative acknowledgement. For a long moment, he remained motionless. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his own hand in response, before turning his paint pony and disappearing into the shadows, gathering beneath the pines. Genevieve wore their mother's best dress to supper with Claude Devereaux, pale blue silk that still carried the ghost of lavender sachet. She returned well after midnight, her face drawn and pale, and would not meet Phoebe's questioning gaze as she changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the quilts. "What did he say?" Phoebe finally asked into the darkness. He was exceptionally courteous. He discussed the ranch's prospects, the railroad surveys planned for next spring, and the opportunities available to those positioned to capitalize on them. Genevieve's voice sounded thin and strained. He explained that a woman managing property alone invites predation from unscrupulous men. He suggested that legal protections become necessary. He made it clear that... She stopped, swallowing audibly. He believes marriage to him would provide such protection. He implied father would have approved of such an arrangement. Marriage. He was perfectly proper. He did not press for an immediate answer, but his expectation was unmistakable. Genevieve turned her face to the wall. I believe father made some promise to him before he died. I believe that is why Devereaux assisted us in coming here at all. Phoebe lay awake long after her sister's breathing deepened into sleep, staring at the rough ceiling beams and thinking about Devereaux's manicured hands, his expensive suit so out of place in this frontier settlement, and the way he had looked at Genevieve like a man calculating the value of merchandise. 3 nights later, the truth revealed itself in whispers and lamplight. Devereaux had sent a package to the ranch, fine white fabric for a wedding dress, and a sealed letter for Genevieve with instructions to collect it from his office behind the main warehouse. Genevieve was too exhausted from scrubbing the cabin's filthy floor to make the journey, so Phoebe volunteered, limping through Angel's Crossing's dark streets with the parcel tucked beneath her arm. The freight yard lay silent and empty, the warehouse doors secured with heavy padlocks. But light leaked through gaps in the planking around a smaller structure at the rear, and voices carried through the still night air. Phoebe approached quietly, meaning to knock, but the words stopped her cold. Confirm the transaction. $1,500 for the blonde, $800 for the schoolteacher currently in Kansas City, $1,000 for the widow with 2 boys under 10. Standard terms, half payment upon receipt of telegraph confirmation, balance in gold on delivery. Devereaux's voice as smooth and measured as if discussing commodity grain prices. What about the Thornton woman? A second man, his accent placing him from somewhere in the deep south. Miss Genevieve is already contracted. The buyer in Montana Territory forwarded full payment 3 weeks ago. She will be delivered no later than November 15th, accompanied by the deed transferring water rights to the spring. The contract her father signed before his unfortunate accident binds the marriage ceremony to automatic property transfer upon consummation. Legally impeccable, wonderfully efficient. Phoebe's breath caught in her throat. Her father's accident. He had fallen from his horse and broken his neck 2 days after signing papers Devereaux brought to their Pennsylvania home. Papers, they were told, would settle and rearrange his debts. The other one, the crippled one with the burn scars. A pause, then Devereaux's voice turned cold as January ice, unmarketable. But she represents no threat whatsoever. No one of consequence listens to the testimony of a cripple, particularly one so obviously touched by misfortune. Sheriff Taggart maintaining proper discretion regarding current inventory. The sheriff understands his compensation quite clearly. The current merchandise is secured at the old Silver Point mine until shipment dates. Isolated location, easily defensible, far from casual discovery. And if anyone becomes inquisitive, then tragic accidents occur with unfortunate regularity in such harsh territory. The scrape of chair legs on wood flooring. Civilization has not yet fully arrived in Wyoming Territory, Sheriff. The wilderness claims lives constantly, and no one questions such natural attrition. The board beneath Phoebe's left foot chose that moment to groan like a dying man. The door exploded outward, and a massive shape lunged through a bull-shouldered man with a gleaming steel hook where his right hand should have been. His good hand shot out and seized her shoulder in a grip that ground flesh against bone. Phoebe reacted on pure instinct. She drove her nails across his face, felt skin part and blood well hot beneath her fingers, and twisted free with desperate strength. He bellowed like a wounded bear and dragged a revolver from his belt. The shot was deafeningly loud in the confined space, the muzzle flash searing purple afterimages across her vision. The bullet missed, but struck a rain barrel beside the door, and the barrel disintegrated in an explosion of water that drenched her instantly and turned the ground beneath her feet into slick mud. "Harry, bring her back!" Phoebe ran. Her damaged leg betrayed her within 10 steps, and she went down hard, tasting blood and mud. Behind her, Harry fired twice more, the bullets cracking past close enough that she felt their passage. The cottonwoods lining the river were 20 yards distant, then 15, then she was rolling down the steep bank, and the cold water closed over her head. She surfaced, choking her sodden skirts, trying to drag her under, and clawed her way toward the opposite bank. Harry's curses faded behind her, replaced by the river's rush and her own desperate gasping. A hand clamped around her wrist like an iron shackle. Terror gave her strength to fight. But a low voice cut through her panic. "Be still. You are safe now." The Lakota warrior hauled her from the water with seemingly effortless strength, then crouched beside her in the deep shadow beneath a willow's trailing branches. His carbine was slung across his back, and a long-bladed knife rested in his right hand, but he made no threatening move. He simply waited while she coughed river water and tried to control her violent shaking. "You are injured," he said quietly. Not a question, but a statement of observed fact. "I heard them talking." The words tumbled out between gasps for air. "Devereaux, the sheriff. They are selling women like livestock, trafficking them to mining camps and settlements. My sister is already sold. They plan to ship her to Montana before the middle of November and steal our land through some contract my father signed." Something shifted behind the warrior's gray eyes, a hardening like water, freezing solid. "You have evidence of this? Ledgers, contracts, legal documents, all locked in his office safe. Then we must acquire them." "We?" She stared at him, water streaming from her hair. "You do not even know who I am. You are the woman who did not scream when armed men attacked your wagon. You are the sister whose own family does not truly see her." He rose fluidly and extended his hand. "My name is Enepe. I work as a scout and translator for the army garrison, and I have heard whispered rumors of this trade in women for many months. Now I have a witness." His gaze dropped to the bruise already darkening her shoulder, where Harry had grabbed her. "And I have sufficient reason to involve myself in what I once considered white man's business that did not concern me." Phoebe took his offered hand and let him pull her upright, her damaged leg nearly buckling beneath her weight. In that moment, standing dripping and shaking in the darkness, while her sister slept, unknowing in the cabin, Phoebe made a choice that would alter the course of both their lives. She met Enepe's eyes and saw reflected there the same isolation she had carried since childhood, the loneliness of those whom society has marked as other, as less as unworthy of notice. "When do we go after those documents?" she asked. "Tomorrow night," he replied. "And this time you will not go alone into the darkness." They waited until the freight yard lay silent and dark, 2 hours past midnight, when even the saloons had shuttered their windows and Angel's Crossing slept off its nightly indulgences. Enepe had spent the intervening day studying Devereux's warehouse from various vantage points, mapping guard rotations, noting structural weaknesses. He did not rely on stealth or clever tricks, but on simple, brutal practicality. Arthur Caldwell, a farmer struggling to keep his small herd alive on land adjacent to the Thornton property, had loaned them a crowbar after Phoebe explained enough to convince him this was not mere thievery. She carried it wrapped in burlap, its weight both reassuring and terrifying, as they moved through the narrow alleys behind the commercial buildings. They nearly collided with a drunk cowhand, who staggered from a side door, his horse shying and nearly trampling them both. Enepe reacted instantly, shoving Phoebe back against a stack of freight crates and bracing his arm above her head to form a barrier against the animal's flailing hooves. They froze there, barely breathing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell leather and wood smoke on his buckskin shirt. The cowhand cursed his horse, jerked the reins viciously, and rode off into the darkness, oblivious to their presence. "You could have let me get kicked," Phoebe whispered once he had gone. "Might have saved you future trouble." "No," Enepe said quietly, his voice carrying an intensity that startled her. "I could not have done that." At the warehouse office, he examined the door's padlock and hasp with professional efficiency. His left forearm, she noticed, was wrapped in a blood-stained cloth bandage. When she reached to touch it in concern, he did not pull away. "A few weeks ago, during a dispute over hunting grounds," he explained. "Army patrol and Lakota hunters. A bullet grazed me before cooler minds prevailed. It is healing but slowly." "Then let me do the heavy work," she said, taking the crowbar from his hands. Together they worked the iron bar into the gap between hasp and wood, Phoebe bracing, while Enepe added his strength to the leverage. The wood groaned in protest, every sound amplified by darkness and fear. Sweat slicked her palms despite the night's chill. Finally, with a sharp crack like snapping bone, the hasp tore free and the door sagged open. Inside the office smelled of tobacco ink, and something else, a cologne or pomade, that marked it as Devereux's private space. A strongbox sat beneath the desk, secured with a formidable padlock that would have defeated any attempt at delicate lockpicking. Enepe did not attempt delicacy. He wedged the crowbar beneath the lid and threw his full weight against it. Metal shrieked in protest, or the lock bent, and then the lid tore open, with a sound like tearing canvas. They stuffed ledgers and rolled contracts into a grain sack, working by feel in the near-total darkness. Phoebe's searching fingers found a bundle of telegraph flimsy papers tied with string, and she added those without pausing to examine them. Outside, a dog began barking with rising urgency. Boot heels hammered on the warehouse floor below them. "Someone is in the office." Devereaux's voice sharp with alarm and fury. Enepe killed the shielded lantern they had brought and caught Phoebe's hand, guiding her to the window. He lifted her through the narrow opening with careful attention to her injured leg, then pulled himself through and dropped into the darkness beyond. They landed in a pile of empty seed sacks that broke their fall but drove the air from their lungs. Harry's distinctive silhouette, made grotesque by the hook, gleaming in lamplight, filled the shattered doorway. There, moving toward the wagons. They fled through the freight yard's labyrinth of stacked lumber and covered wagons. When Phoebe's leg finally betrayed her and she stumbled, Enepe caught her around the waist and half carried her into the deeper shadows between buildings. They crouched there, hearts hammering in counterpoint, while Harry and 3 other men searched the yard with lanterns and loaded weapons, their threats and promises of reward, carrying clear in the still air. Dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold before they finally dared to move from their hiding place. Dr. Remy Laurent cleared space on his examination table with the methodical care of a man who had learned not to waste motion. He was perhaps 60 years old, his face seamed with lines that spoke of too much suffering witnessed and too little sleep obtained. His hands showed a fine tremor that Phoebe recognized as laudanum's telltale sign. But his eyes remained sharp and intelligent as he spread the stolen documents across the scarred wood surface. On the corner of the table, partially hidden beneath a stack of medical journals bound in cracked leather, sat a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. The image showed a much younger Remy standing beside a dark-haired woman of striking beauty and a small boy in short pants, all 3 formally posed in their finest clothing. But the woman's face had been systematically scratched away, not in a single violent act, but gradually, obsessively, until only a ghostly blur remained where her features had been. "Cholera took them in New Orleans," Dr. Remy said without looking up from the documents, his French accent thickening. "I was trained as a physician. I should have recognized the signs earlier, acted more decisively. Instead, I hesitated, consulted with colleagues, followed proper protocols. By the time I trusted my own judgment, it was too late." He touched the frame briefly, then turned his attention back to the ledgers. "I will not make that mistake twice." He read in silence for several minutes, his expression growing progressively darker. Finally, he looked up at the small group assembled in his cabin: Phoebe and Enepe, Arthur Caldwell, and Julia Brennan, the town's schoolteacher. A rail-thin woman with iron-gray hair, who had come west because Eastern schools refused to employ females, who insisted on speaking uncomfortable truths. "This is a systematic trade in women of remarkable sophistication," Dr. Remy said at last. "These ledgers document purchases, transportation arrangements, and delivery locations. Women acquired through false employment offers, mail-order bride schemes, and outright abduction. And this," he held up a contract written in both English and ornate French legal language, "this binds your sister's marriage to Devereux to an automatic transfer of water rights. The moment the marriage is consummated, legal ownership of the spring passes to a syndicate Devereux represents. Brilliant in its ruthlessness, completely legal under territorial law, utterly monstrous in its execution." Julia Brennan leaned over his shoulder, her lips moving as she parsed the dense legal terminology. 14 women are listed here by name and purchase price, currently held at a location identified only as Silver Point Mine. She looked at Enepe. "Do you know this place?" "I know it well. An abandoned silver mine in the foothills north of here, perhaps 2 hours' hard ride. A single entrance that would be easy to defend. Isolated enough that screams would not carry to any settlement." Arthur Caldwell stroked his beard thoughtfully. I worked that mine 7 years ago before the vein played out. There is a main entrance, yes, but also a ventilation shaft that opens onto a ledge overlooking a ravine. A man who knew where to look could potentially approach from above, though the climb would be treacherous. Phoebe felt a cold clarity settle over her like ice water. Then we ride there. We free those women. We bring them back to Angel's Crossing where they can testify before witnesses about what was done to them. That is suicidal madness, Dr. Remy said bluntly. Devereaux commands significant resources, hired guns legal protection from the sheriff political connections throughout the territory. He will not hesitate to kill anyone who threatens his operation. Then we bring sufficient force to match his, Enepe said quietly. And we accept that this action may cost us our lives. Arthur nodded slowly. Julia straightened her shoulders and said, I will help. Dr. Remy looked again at the scratched daguerreotype, at the ghost of the woman whose face he had tried to erase and failed. I failed my family when decisiveness might have saved them. He said softly, I will not fail others by waiting for perfect conditions that will never arrive. Count me among your number. But Claude Devereaux was not a man who waited for threats to fully materialize. 2 days after the break-in at his warehouse, a line shack on Arthur Caldwell's property burned to the ground in the pre-dawn darkness. 2 of Arthur's thin cattle were slaughtered with professional efficiency and left to rot their blood soaking into the trampled earth. A Lakota arrow, or a convincing facsimile, was driven deep into a fence post where no one could miss it. By noon, Sheriff Taggart was riding through Angel's Crossing, stirring up fear with shouts about Indian depredations and the need for immediate punitive response. The Army commander at the nearby garrison was a nervous political creature named Colonel Whitmore, who cared more about his advancement than about justice or truth. Eager to demonstrate decisive action before railroad surveyors arrived to assess the territory, he ordered an immediate search of the Lakota encampment north of town. Soldiers swept through the camp like a prairie fire through dry grass, overturning food stores, scattering possessions, trampling sacred objects with deliberate contempt. When a frightened boy of perhaps 8 years threw a stone at a trooper who had kicked his grandmother, the soldier responded with a rifle butt that cracked 2 of the child's ribs with a sound like breaking kindling. Enepe was there when it happened. He had been visiting the camp to warn his people about Devereaux's operation and the danger it represented. When the soldiers came, he stepped between the trooper and the weeping child. The confrontation escalated with terrifying speed. Shouting in 2 languages, rifles swinging up old hatreds and new fears colliding. Someone fired a shot later. No one could say with certainty who, and the bullet tore through Enepe's left thigh, the impact spinning him around and dropping him into the dust like a slaughtered animal. Blood pumped from the wound in rhythmic spurts, bright arterial crimson spreading across his buckskin leggings. Around him, the camp erupted into chaos, women screaming, soldiers shouting, dogs barking in frenzied alarm. Tall Elk, the band's chief, and a man who had known Enepe since childhood, stood over him and looked down with eyes that held nothing but bitter disappointment. You told us that working for the white soldiers would protect our children. You promised us that your position would build a bridge between our peoples. I see now that you were wrong. This is the fruit of your bridge. Enepe, white-lipped with shock and pain, had no answer to give. They carried him to Dr. Remy's cabin, on a travois jolting over every rock and root. The bullet had passed completely through the thick muscle of his thigh, missing the bone by perhaps half an inch, but tearing through tissue like a hot knife through tallow. Remy cleaned the wound with carbolic acid that made Enepe's back arch. Despite his attempts at stoicism, stitched the ragged edges with horsehair thread and bound it tightly with linen bandages soaked in willow bark tea for the pain and inflammation. The bullet missed the major vessels, and the bone, Dr. Remy told him, washing blood from his hands in a basin. You will walk again, but not for several weeks. You will not ride hard or run or fight effectively for considerably longer than that. Colonel Whitmore arrived that afternoon with a clerk bearing official papers. Scout Enape, he said without preamble, not bothering to sit or even remove his gloves. Your presence in this territory has become a source of ongoing disruption and instability. The Army no longer requires your services. You are hereby released from your contract effective immediately. He dropped a small leather purse on the table. Final wages, calculated to the day, and departed without another word. Enape lay on the narrow cot and stared at the cabin's rough ceiling. He was a man without a place, now trusted by neither the whites he had worked for nor the Lakota he had claimed to protect. He had been useful once, valued for his skills. Now he was simply another wounded Indian with no prospects and no purpose. Phoebe arrived at sunset, bringing Julia and Arthur with her. She sat on the edge of the cot, and the mattress barely shifted beneath her slight weight. Her eyes held no pity, only the same fierce determination he had seen when she crawled through the mud to escape Harry's bullets. Those women in the mine cannot wait for you to heal, she said without preamble. Devereaux is moving his schedule forward. I heard Harry talking in town this morning. They plan to transport the women north within the week before anyone can investigate the allegations. If we wait until you can walk properly, those women will be scattered across a dozen territories, and we will never find them all. I cannot climb mine shafts. I cannot fight. He gestured at his bandaged leg. I am worse than useless to you. I would only slow you down and get you killed. Then you lean on me when you need to, and we move more carefully than we would otherwise. She met his eyes without flinching, without embarrassment. You are the only person who knows that terrain well enough to guide us in darkness. I am the only person Devereaux and his men consistently underestimate and ignore. Arthur knows the mine's internal layout. Julia has connections to get word to federal authorities if we fail. Dr. Remy has the medical skills to tend wounds. Together, we represent enough strength to attempt this. Separately, we have no chance whatsoever. He studied her scarred face, her twisted leg, her work-roughened hands, and saw clearly what he had only sensed before: not weakness made stubborn, but strength forged in the kind of suffering that either destroys a person entirely or tempers them into something unbreakable. When do we ride? He asked. Tonight, she answered. Under darkness, when Devereaux's men will not expect movement. They departed Angel's Crossing 2 hours after full dark, 7 riders moving north through scattered pine forest toward the foothills. Enape rode his paint pony with his injured leg, bound tightly and braced with splints fashioned from green willow. Every jolt and shift sent fresh waves of pain radiating from thigh to hip, and cold sweat soaked his shirt despite the night's chill. Phoebe rode beside him on a borrowed mare, her own damaged leg aching in sympathy, though she gave no outward sign of discomfort. Arthur Caldwell carried his Winchester and a coil of good hemp rope. Julia Brennan wore a split riding skirt that would have scandalized Angel's Crossing's respectable women, and carried medical supplies in well-packed saddlebags. Dr. Remy, who by all reasonable measure was too old for such ventures, rode a steady mule and kept one hand near the holstered revolver at his belt. 2 Lakota warriors met them at the forest's edge, running elk, who had hunted with Enape as boys before the whites came in numbers, and Black Feather, whose younger sister was among the women Devereaux held. They brought their own rifles, their own grievances, and a grim silence that spoke more eloquently than words. The trail climbed steeply through increasingly rocky terrain. The air grew thin and cold, carrying the scent of pine resin and snow from the high peaks. At one point, Enape's injured leg gave out entirely, and he began to slide from the saddle. Phoebe was off her mare, instantly bracing herself against his side and taking part of his weight despite her own limp. Together they stumbled forward until he could regain his seat. I will not speak of this to anyone, he said through clenched teeth, pain and something deeper gratitude perhaps, or recognition roughening his voice. "You pulled me from the river when I would have drowned." Phoebe replied quietly. "You protected me from a drunken rider's horse. I believe this makes us, even though I am not keeping a ledger of such debts." The mine entrance appeared as a darker shadow against the hillside's darkness, its timber frame barely visible in the starlight. 2 guards sat by a small fire rifles, leaning against nearby rocks, tin cups steaming in their hands, as they passed a bottle back and forth. Running elk and black feather moved through the darkness like smoke given form. The attack was sudden and utterly silent, rifle butts to skulls' forearms, across throats, and both guards dropped unconscious without firing a shot or uttering a sound. Arthur dragged their limp bodies into the brush and secured them with rope. Dr. Remy studied the mine entrance with growing concern. Just inside the mouth, stacked against the timber frame, sat wooden crates stenciled with faded lettering. DuPont blasting powder handle with extreme care. White crystals had formed on several of the crate surfaces where nitroglycerin had sweated through the wax paper wrapping, making the dynamite dangerously unstable and prone to detonation from any sharp impact. "One spark from a bullet strike," Dr. Remy murmured, mostly to himself. "One careless footfall that jars those crates, and this entire section of mountain comes down on whoever is inside." "Then we are careful," Enterprise said grimly, "and we shoot straight." They lit 2 lanterns and descended into the earth. The main tunnel was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing Enterprise to stoop awkwardly as he limped forward using a carved walking stick for support. The air grew progressively colder and heavier, thick with moisture, and the smell of damp stone, old iron, and something worse, human waste, unwashed bodies, and the particular stench of fear that permeates enclosed spaces where people are kept against their will. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the darkness ahead, each drop echoing with eerie clarity off unseen walls. 50 feet into the mountain, the tunnel widened into a chamber that had been carved from solid granite, when the silver vein still promised wealth. Their chained to iron rings, bolted directly into the living rock, sat 14 women. Their faces were gaunt with malnutrition and hollow with despair, their wrists rubbed raw and bleeding where iron manacles had scraped skin away. A German girl who could not have been more than 17 clutched an infant wrapped in rags that had once been a dress. A Mexican woman with fierce dark eyes spat what were certainly curses in Spanish when she saw men with guns entering her prison. "No teman," Julia said quickly, stepping forward with both hands raised, palms out. "Please do not be afraid. We have not come to harm you. We have come to take you away from this place." Dr. Remy knelt beside the nearest woman and examined the padlocks that secured the chains. They were cheap, mass-produced locks, sturdy enough to hold prisoners, but not designed to withstand determined force. Arthur wedged the crowbar into the first hasp and applied steady pressure until the metal groaned, bent, and finally snapped with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. Phoebe moved among the captive women, speaking softly in English and the little Spanish she had learned from a housekeeper in Pennsylvania. She explained who they were, what they intended, and why the women should trust these strangers who appeared from darkness with tools and weapons. One of them, a young Irish woman with flame-red hair and a face full of freckles, seized Phoebe's hand and wept openly. Her name was Bridget, and her story came in broken gasps. "He took me the second night after I arrived in Angel's Crossing. I had answered an advertisement for a housekeeper position. He said I was too pretty for housework, that I would fetch a better price in the Montana mining camps. I never even got to write a letter home telling my mother where I had gone." Behind them at the tunnel entrance, Ennepe and the 2 Lakota warriors stood watch with rifles ready and every sense attuned to the darkness beyond their circle of lamplight. They had broken 5 locks and freed half the women when a voice cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel cut through the chamber. I strongly suggest that everyone cease moving immediately." Claude Devereaux stood at the chamber entrance, flanked by 6 armed men whose weapons were already trained on the rescue party. His suit was as immaculate as ever, his posture relaxed, but his pale eyes burned with barely controlled fury. Harry stood at his right hand, the hook gleaming dully in the lamplight, a sawed-off shotgun cradled in his good arm. The scratches Phoebe's nails had left on his face had scabbed over into livid red lines that gave him an even more monstrous appearance. "You have made a catastrophic error in judgment," Devereaux said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man accustomed to absolute power. "This is private property purchased and paid for. These women are bound by legal contracts they signed of their own free will. You are trespassers, thieves, and I am entirely within my legal rights to defend what is mine through whatever means prove necessary." Enepe shifted his weight carefully, raising his carbine despite his injured leg. "These women are not property under any law that deserves to be called civilized." "How philosophical of you, Scout." Devereaux's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "But the territorial law is quite clear. These women owe debts for transportation, for room and board, for various services rendered. Their contracts are legally binding documents. If you remove them without satisfying those debts, you are thieves and kidnappers, and I will see you hang for it. Then, arrest us." Julia snapped, stepping forward despite Arthur's restraining hand on her arm. "Place us under lawful arrest. Take us before a judge. Allow these women to testify in open court about how their contracts were obtained through fraud and deception." Devereaux's smile widened into something that resembled amusement, but felt like the baring of teeth before a strike. "I think not, madam. Harry, if you would be so kind as to set the charges." Harry moved to the stack of dynamite crates near the tunnel mouth and began pulling out individual sticks with practiced efficiency. The nitroglycerin sweat on their surfaces made them glisten in the lamplight. He wedged sticks into crevices between the timber support beams, then unspooled a length of fuse cord that hissed softly as he worked. Dr. Remy's face went completely white. "You will kill everyone in this chamber, your own men included. Yourself quite possibly if the blast brings down enough rock. A regrettable tragedy, I assure you." Devereaux examined his immaculate fingernails, as if the conversation bored him profoundly. A group of unstable individuals, a disgraced Indian scout, a crippled woman with a history of hysteria, a drunken farmer broke into an abandoned mine and carelessly tampered with old explosives they did not understand. The resulting explosion killed them, and sadly several unfortunate women they had apparently kidnapped for purposes unknown. The story will write itself quite tidily. I may even erect a small memorial marker noting the tragic accident. The first fuse caught with a soft whoosh, and a tiny orange spark began crawling along the cord toward the dynamite, wedged against the nearest support beam. Enepe fired. The shot in that confined space was not merely loud, but physically painful, a concussive wave that left ears ringing and eyes watering. Devereaux's men returned fire in a ragged, undisciplined volley. Muzzle flashes strobed through the chamber like lightning. Bullets sparked off granite walls, sending rock chips flying like shrapnel. A woman screamed. Running elk grunted and staggered backward, blood spreading dark and wet across his buckskin shirt where a bullet had torn through his shoulder. Arthur and Black Feather laid down covering fire while Dr. Remy and Julia hauled the freed women toward a narrow crack in the chamber's far wall. A side passage Arthur had remembered from his time working the mine years ago, barely wide enough for a grown person to squeeze through sideways. The first explosion was not sound so much as a physical blow that transcended hearing. The concussion slammed everyone to the ground. Timber beams shrieked and splintered. Rock and debris rained from above in a deadly cascade. The chamber filled instantly with choking dust and acrid black smoke that burned eyes and lungs. A A main support beam cracked with a sound like a tree splitting during a lightning strike. It tilted at a sickening angle, and the ceiling above began to sag ominously. Through the swirling dust and smoke, Enepe saw Harry crouched beside the largest support pillar, the massive timber that bore the weight of the entire chamber ceiling, lighting a second, much longer fuse. The stick wedged there was easily twice the size of the first. 20 pounds of dynamite or more. Enough explosive force to bring the entire section of mountain down and seal the mine forever. Enepe tried to rise and rush forward, but his wounded leg buckled completely. He went down hard, tasting blood and dust, his vision swimming. Phoebe, coughing violently and nearly blind in the smoke, heard him fall and turned back despite Julia's screamed command to keep moving. Dr. Remy Laurent saw everything in a single moment of perfect, terrible clarity. The fuse burning steadily toward massive explosive force. The women stumbling through darkness toward possible safety. Enepe struggling to rise on a leg that would not support him. Phoebe crawling back toward certain death rather than abandon someone who needed help. Harry backing toward the exit, his ruined face split in a grin of savage triumph. The old French doctor looked once at the daguerreotype he carried in his vest pocket, at the ghost of a woman whose face he had tried unsuccessfully to forget for 20 years, at the small boy who had died screaming for a father who arrived too late and understood what he needed to do. He ran straight at Harry, closing the distance in 3 long strides, and hit him with the full weight of his body behind the tackle. They crashed together into the dynamite crate. Harry's shotgun discharged both barrels simultaneously, and the double load of buckshot tore through Remy's side and back, shredding flesh and smashing ribs. But the old doctor did not let go. He wrapped both arms around Harry and the explosives, both his blood pouring hot over the wooden crate, and dragged them deeper into the tunnel, away from the women, away from any possible escape. "Go!" he roared with the last strength in his lungs, his voice somehow rising above the roar of collapsing rock. "Run now. Do not look back." Enepe grabbed Phoebe's wrist hard enough to bruise and hauled her bodily to her feet. Arthur and Black Feather were already herding the last women into the side passage when the second explosion detonated with a force that transcended human experience. The world became nothing but noise and pressure and falling stone. The main chamber collapsed completely, the ceiling coming down in massive granite slabs that sealed the main tunnel as effectively as 1,000 feet of solid rock. The shock wave flung them forward through the narrow passage, and Phoebe felt stone chips slice through her dress and into the skin of her back and shoulders. Ahead, impossibly, a thin crack of paler darkness appeared, a fissure in the rock, leading upward toward the night sky. They climbed because there was no other choice. Enepe went first, despite his wounded leg, testing each handhold before committing his weight, pulling himself upward through sheer determination, while his injured thigh burned and bled. He reached back to pull Phoebe up behind him, hauling her bodily over obstacles she could not have managed alone. Her hands, already torn and bleeding from the rough stone, left crimson smears on the granite. Behind them came the women, helping one another, passing children upward from hand to hand, driven by terror and the human animal's desperate refusal to surrender to death. The fissure opened onto a narrow ledge, perhaps 15 feet long, and no more than 4 feet wide, perched above a ravine that dropped away into darkness. The sun set, for impossibly the sun was just setting. Though it seemed days since they had entered the mine, he painted the canyon walls in shades of deep copper and dried blood. Below, perhaps 200 feet down the mine entrance, vomited smoke and rubble in a continuous black stream. The only way down was a rusted mining cable hanging from an old hoist mechanism bolted to the cliff face. The cable was pitted with corrosion and frayed in several places where individual strands had parted, but it was the only option available. Arthur rigged a makeshift harness from the rope he had brought and began lowering women one by one. The cable groaned with each load, more threads snapping with small pinging sounds like plucked harp strings, but somehow it continued to hold. Julia went down, and then the children, then the German girl clutching her infant. Claude Devereux emerged from the fissure, his fine suit torn and filthy blood streaming from a deep gash across his forehead, but his eyes clear and deadly as winter ice. He raised his revolver and fired without hesitation. The bullet passed so close to Phoebe's head that she felt its wind and heard it crack against the stone behind her, spraying granite chips that stung her cheek and neck. Enepe shoved her behind him with one arm and raised his carbine with the other. But the magazine was empty spent during the firefight in the chamber below. He threw the useless weapon aside and drew the bone-handled knife from his belt, its long blade honed to razor sharpness. Devereux advanced along the narrow ledge, reloading his revolver with practiced, unhurried efficiency. "You should have remained with your Lakota people scout," he said conversationally, as if discussing weather rather than murder. "This situation does not concern you. But since you have chosen to involve yourself, you will die alongside her." He fired again. The bullet caught Enepe in the right side of his chest, punching through muscle and glancing off a rib. The impact spun him halfway around, and he dropped to one knee, blood spreading between the fingers he pressed to the wound. But he kept the knife raised and his eyes fixed on Devereux. Phoebe did not pause to think or plan. She grabbed the iron crank that operated the hoist mechanism and swung it with every ounce of strength her slight frame possessed. The heavy iron connected with Devereux's right wrist with a sickening crunch of splintering bone. His revolver tumbled from suddenly nerveless fingers and disappeared over the edge of the precipice. Devereux lunged at her with his left hand, fingers closing around her throat like iron bands. They grappled at the very edge of the drop, his weight forcing her backward, his grip compressing her windpipe until her vision began to narrow into a red-tinged tunnel, shot through with black sparks. Enepe, bleeding heavily from both thigh and chest, threw himself forward with a Lakota war cry torn from deep in his chest. He drove his knife up beneath Devereux's ribs, angling for the heart, and twisted the blade with brutal efficiency. Devereux's eyes went wide with shock. His grip on Phoebe's throat loosened. Blood bubbled from his lips as he tried to speak. Enepe wrenched him backward away from Phoebe, and with one final tremendous effort, sent him stumbling toward the edge. Claude Devereux, master manipulator and trafficker of human souls, fell silently into the darkness of the ravine. No final curse or plea escaped his lips. He simply vanished into shadow. No one heard him strike bottom, though they all heard the echo of falling rocks moments later. Phoebe collapsed against the stone cliff face, gasping and choking her throat, already darkening with bruises. Enepe slumped beside her, his face gray as old Ash's blood soaking through his buckskin shirt in spreading stains. Below, Arthur and the women waved frantically and called for them to descend. Phoebe's hands shook so violently she could barely tie knots, but she worked with stubborn determination to secure the cable around Enepe's chest. "I am not leaving you here to bleed to death. You must go first," he managed through gritted teeth. "I am too heavy. If the cable breaks while lowering me, at least you will already be safe. Be quiet." She looped the cable twice, tested every knot with the thoroughness Julia had drilled into her during rope practice behind the schoolhouse, and began feeding the line through the pulley. Inch by agonizing inch, she lowered him down the cliff face, while Arthur and Black Feather guided him away from jagged outcrops. Only when he reached the bottom safely did she tie the cable around her own waist and climb down hand over bloodied hand, her damaged leg dangling uselessly until she reached the canyon floor and collapsed into the dirt beside him. They made camp in a sheltered hollow perhaps a mile from the collapsed mine, too exhausted to travel further that night. The freed women huddled together, wrapped in blankets. Arthur had brought their faces still drawn with shock and disbelief. Julia moved among them, checking for injuries, and offering what comfort words could provide. Running Elk sat with his back against a boulder, while Black Feather packed his shoulder wound with moss and bound it tight. Phoebe knelt beside Enepe, who lay on his back with his eyes closed, breathing in short, shallow gasps. Blood had soaked through Julia's hasty bandaging, and his skin felt cold and clammy to her touch, the warning signs of significant blood loss. She carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandages Julia had applied in the frantic minutes after they reached the canyon floor. The bullet wound in his chest was clean through and through, missing anything immediately vital. But the hole in his thigh from the earlier shooting had torn open again during the climb and the fight with Devereaux. "Hold still," she said unnecessarily, since he lacked the strength to move. She reached for the medical supplies Julia had left nearby and began cleaning the wounds with whiskey from Arthur's flask. Her hands, torn and bleeding themselves, remained steady despite the trembling in her arms and shoulders. Enepe's eyes opened, watching her work with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. "You do not have to do this. Julia has more medical training." "Yes," Phoebe said quietly, echoing his words from the night they had broken into Devereaux's office together. "I do have to do this." She packed both wounds with clean linen torn from her already ruined petticoat and tied the bandages with knots that would hold. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping blood from her hands onto her skirt. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire Arthur had built crackled softly. Somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called with a sound like falling water. The stars overhead were impossibly bright and cold. Enepe raised his right hand slowly, as if the movement cost him significant effort, and touched the burn scars along the left side of Phoebe's neck. His fingers traced the old damage with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had just driven a knife into a man's chest. It was not a romantic gesture or a declaration of attraction. It was something deeper and more fundamental, a wordless acknowledgement of recognition. "I see you. Not the scars or the limp or the way others look through you as if you do not exist. I see the person who cut a rope to save a stranger, who crawled through mud and blood, rather than surrender, who refused to leave anyone behind, even when doing so would have saved her own life." Phoebe covered his hand with both of hers, holding it against her scarred skin, and understood that this moment, this quiet recognition passing between two people society had dismissed and discarded, held more value than any pretty speech or grand romantic declaration could ever contain. They remained like that, hands joined, until the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. Two survivors sitting beside a dying fire, bound together by shared survival, and something deeper that neither needed to name aloud. The sun was well risen when they finally rode into Angel's Crossing on the morning of November 15th. The freed women walked in a ragged column down the main street, wrapped in blankets and spare clothing, carrying children, supporting those too weak to walk alone. Julia Brennan and Arthur Caldwell flanked them, rifles ready, daring anyone to interfere. Enepe rode his paint pony hunched over the saddle horn, kept upright only by Phoebe walking beside him, with one hand pressed to his back. Running Elk and Black Feather brought up the rear, their weapons visible and their expressions promising violence to anyone who threatened this procession. The town fell silent as they passed. Men stopped mid-conversation, hands dropping to weapons they wisely chose not to draw. Women emerged onto porches and balconies, shading their eyes against the morning sun. Children stared wide-eyed from doorways. Sheriff Taggart stepped out of his office, one hand resting on his holstered revolver, but he made no move to draw it. His eyes moved across the group, calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. The German girl with the infant walked directly to the center of the street, turned to face the gathering crowd, and spoke in heavily accented but clear English that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent town. "My name is Greta Hoffman," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I am 17 years old. 3 months ago in Kansas City, I answered an advertisement for domestic work in Wyoming Territory. When I arrived, I was taken to a warehouse and sold to that man. She pointed directly at Sheriff Taggart. For $800, I was locked in a mine with 13 other women and told we would be transported to mining camps in Montana and sold again to men who had paid in advance for wives, whether we consented or not. She shifted the infant in her arms and continued, "This baby was born in that mine 3 weeks ago. Her father is one of the guards who raped me repeatedly. I do not even know his name. These people," she gestured at Phoebe Enepe and the others, "risked their lives to free us. A man named Dr. Remy Laurent died so that we could escape. I will swear to every word I have spoken before any judge, any marshal, any authority you wish to bring. And so will every woman standing here with me." One by one, the other women stepped forward and told their stories. Bridget, the Irish girl, described answering a letter offering employment as a housekeeper, only to be drugged with laudanum in her first meal and waking in chains. Esperanza, the Mexican woman with the fierce eyes, recounted being smuggled across the border in a locked freight wagon with 6 other women, all promised work as seamstresses. A thin blonde girl from Pennsylvania named Sarah, who could not have been more than 16, explained through tears how she had been hired as a schoolteacher through letters signed by Claude Devereaux, only to be seized the moment she stepped off the stage. Julia Brennan produced the ledgers and contracts they had stolen from Devereaux's office. She spread them on a barrel in the middle of the street and read aloud in a voice that carried to every building names, purchase prices, delivery dates, telegraph confirmations, payments received. Each entry reduced a human being to a commodity, a line item in an accounting of evil. Genevieve Thornton stood on the porch of the Mercantile, tears streaming down her beautiful face, and watched as her name appeared in the ledger Julia was reading. Genevieve Thornton purchased for $1,500 delivery to J. Blackwood, Montana Territory. No later than 15th of November, 1878. Payment received in full property transfer of water rights to be completed upon consummation of marriage to Claude Devereaux, as per contract signed by Samuel Thornton. For weeks, Genevieve had believed herself special chosen, worthy of a wealthy man's courtship. Now the truth stripped away every illusion she had ever held about her own value in the eyes of men like Devereaux. She had been merchandise purchased and paid for her beauty, nothing more than a premium price on a trafficker's ledger. She descended from the porch, and the crowd parted to let her through. When she reached the center of the street, she turned to face the townspeople who had watched her with envy and approval for weeks. "My name is Genevieve Thornton," she said, her voice shaking but growing stronger as she spoke. "Claude Devereaux intended to marry me and take ownership of my family's land through a contract my father signed before he died. Devereaux told me it was for my own protection, that women could not manage property alone, that I needed a man's guidance and strength. But those were lies. Every word was a lie." She looked directly at Phoebe, who stood supporting Enepe with blood on her torn dress and bruises darkening her throat. Something like wonder crossed Genevieve's face. "My sister discovered the truth when I was too blind to see it. She risked everything to save me and to save these women. I have been a fool, vain and shallow, and willfully blind to anything that threatened my comfortable illusions. But I am done being a fool. Claude Devereaux trafficked women like cattle, and Sheriff Taggart protected him for money. They should both hang for what they have done." The army commander arrived within 2 hours, accompanied by a full platoon of soldiers summoned by a telegram Julia had sent 3 days earlier through a freight office in a neighboring town. He listened to testimony from all 14 freed women, examined the ledgers and contracts with increasingly dark expression, and placed Sheriff Taggart under arrest. A federal marshal was already en route from Cheyenne, summoned by the same telegram with authority to investigate territorial corruption. Claude Devereaux's body was recovered 4 days later from the ravine below the mine. His neck was broken and his chest crushed by impact with the rocks, but his face remained recognizable. He was buried in an unmarked grave outside the town cemetery, and no one spoke words over the site. Dr. Remy Laurent was laid to rest on a hillside overlooking Angel's Crossing beneath a simple cross of white-painted wood and a headstone of local granite. Julia Brennan had arranged for a stonemason to carve the words, "Remy Laurent, physician, friend hero, his sacrifice redeemed more than he knew." Julia read aloud from a book Dr. Remy had loaned her months earlier, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, a French novel about redemption and the chains that bind human souls. She read the passage where Jean Valjean chooses sacrifice over survival, and her voice broke only once. Phoebe stood beside Enipe, one hand resting lightly on his arm to help him remain upright, and wept without shame or self-consciousness. The tears were for Dr. Remy, who had died to save strangers. But they were also for her father, who had sold his daughters to save himself from disgrace. For all the women who had been bought and sold like livestock. For Enipe, who had lost his place among both whites and Lakota. For herself marked and dismissed by a world that measured value by appearance. The freed women remained in Angel's Crossing rather than returning to places that had betrayed them. Greta found work at the hotel her infant cared for during the day, by older women who had lost their own children to distance and circumstance. Esperanza opened a small restaurant serving Mexican food that became the most popular dining establishment in town. Bridget became Julia's assistant at the schoolhouse, teaching younger children and helping Julia establish evening literacy classes for adults. Others married local men, but only after Julia insisted they read every word of the marriage contracts, understand what rights they were surrendering, and know what legal protections territorial law provided. Several chose to remain unmarried, forming households together, supporting one another through shared work and shared grief. Genevieve chose a path no one had expected. She worked alongside Julia Brennan, teaching literacy to the freed women and to others who arrived as word spread of a place where women could learn to read the contracts that bound them. She spent her evenings writing letters on behalf of women seeking to contact families they had lost, navigating legal complexities of debt and property, teaching them to recognize the signs of fraud and manipulation. 6 weeks after the mine rescue, she sat with Phoebe on the porch of the ranch house as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. The white roses along the railing were dormant for winter, their stems brown and thorny, but still beautiful in their architecture. I spent my entire life believing that beauty was power, Genevieve said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. I thought that if I was pretty enough, gracious enough, obedient enough, someone would value me enough to protect me. But beauty is not power at all. It is only bait for men like Devereux who see it as merchandise to be bought and sold. She looked at her sister, at the scars and the twisted leg and the work-roughened hands, and smiled with genuine warmth. You were always the strong one, Phoebe. You were always the one who saw clearly and acted decisively. I just could not see it because I was too busy looking at myself in mirrors and believing the lies they told. Phoebe took her sister's hand and squeezed gently. You are strong too. You simply needed to discover that strength for yourself rather than having someone tell you about it. Genevieve nodded, and for the first time in her life, she felt something very much like freedom. On a bitter cold morning in late December, when fresh snow lay thick on the ground and the mountains glittered like crystal against a pale blue sky, Enipe rode to the Thornton Ranch. His chest wound had healed cleanly, leaving only a puckered scar. His thigh still pained him in cold weather, but he walked without limping now. He wore full traditional Lakota dress, a buckskin shirt decorated with intricate quill work and fringe, his long hair braided and wrapped with otter fur, a single eagle feather bound upright at his crown. He was no longer a scout for the army. He was Lakota fully and without compromise or apology. Genevieve and Phoebe stood on the porch in plain wool dresses dyed deep blue, their breath steaming in the cold air. The white roses were skeletal branches covered in frost that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning light. Behind them, the cabin's single window glowed warm with lamplight. The entire town watched from windows and doorways, curious and uneasy about what would happen next. Enipe stopped his paint pony at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at Genevieve. "You have fought when it mattered most. You have stood for truth when doing so cost you social standing and comfort. Your path lies here in this town, teaching those who need your knowledge and your courage. That is honorable work, and you will do it well." Genevieve nodded slowly, understanding blooming in her eyes like winter roses. "And your path does not lie here in town?" "No," Enipe said quietly. "My path lies elsewhere now." Then he turned his full attention to Phoebe and withdrew from his saddlebag a folded document written in English and Lakota, the words clear and formal. "This is a contract," he explained, "drafted by Dr. Remy Laurent before his death and witnessed by Julia Brennan and Arthur Caldwell. It names me as foreman and protector of the Thornton Ranch property, answerable only to Miss Phoebe Thornton as the sole legal owner of the land and water rights. It specifies wages duties and duration of employment. It is entirely legal under territorial law." He paused, and his gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I cannot promise you peace," he said quietly. "The Lakota will not trust white courts, and white settlers will not trust an Indian who claims authority over valuable land. But I can stand here on this ground that is yours, make men think twice before they reach for what they have no right to take. I can negotiate with my people when they come to use the water, ensuring that access is shared fairly rather than hoarded or stolen. I can teach you tracking and hunting so you need never depend on anyone for survival." Phoebe took the document with hands that trembled slightly. She read it slowly, her lips moving over words Julia had taught her to parse during long evening lessons at the schoolhouse. She saw her name at the top, Phoebe Thornton, sole proprietor, and Enipe's mark at the bottom, a carefully drawn image of a running horse, the symbol of his clan. She looked up at him. This man who had pulled her from a river, protected her from bullets, fought beside her in darkness, and never once treated her as if her scars or her limp made her less worthy of respect. "This is a contract of employment," she said carefully. "Not a marriage proposal." "Yes." He met her eyes without flinching. "Among my people, a man proves his worth through actions over time, not through words spoken once and then forgotten. I offer you my service, my protection, and my partnership in defending this land. If in time something deeper grows from that foundation, we will know it is real, because it was built on trust and shared purpose, rather than desperation or convenience." Phoebe took the pencil he offered and signed her name in the careful, precise script Julia had drilled into her Phoebe Thornton. Their fingers brushed as she handed the document back to him. No passionate declarations, no dramatic embrace. Simply a shared understanding forged in gunfire and blood and survival, acknowledged now in daylight before witnesses. Arthur Caldwell, watching from his position near the road, tipped his hat with a broad grin. Julia Brennan wiped tears from her eyes and nodded approval. Running Elk and Black Feather, who had accompanied Enipe, raised their rifles briefly in salute. Genevieve spoke then, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I used to believe freedom meant finding someone strong enough to take care of me, to make my decisions, to shield me from harsh realities. Now I understand that freedom means taking care of myself, making my own choices, facing reality with clear eyes." She looked at Phoebe and Enipe, standing together on the porch. "You taught me that, both of you, and I will not forget the lesson." Enipe climbed the steps carefully, favoring his injured leg, only slightly now. Phoebe shifted her stance without conscious thought, positioning herself so he had space to stand without straining his healing thigh. Two silhouettes framed against the mountains and the endless sky standing together, but not touching partners in a fragile alliance built on mutual respect rather than romantic fantasy. In the spring, when the snow melted and grass returned to the hills, the Lakota would come south to their traditional hunting grounds. Enipe would negotiate on behalf of both his people and the Thornton Ranch, working to establish a shared water agreement that did not depend on army enforcement or government promises that could be broken at political convenience. It would not be a formal treaty, nothing so grand or permanent. But it would be a beginning, a small bridge built by individuals who chose cooperation over conflict. For now, the Lakota warrior who had been dismissed by the army and the scarred woman whom society had always overlooked stood together on a porch dusted with new snow, united in their determination to defend this ground and each other against whatever challenges the harsh territory would bring. The mountains watched in ancient silence. The town whispered behind closed doors, and the story passed into legend: the Lakota warrior who rejected the beautiful golden-haired sister and chose the one with scars and a limp because she was the one who had cut a rope to save a stranger's life, who had led him through darkness without faltering, and who had refused to abandon him even when doing so would have saved her own life. It was a story about courage, about redemption, about two outcasts who found in each other not romantic salvation, but something more valuable: recognition, respect, and partnership in survival.